Thank you for inviting me, and I'm here to talk about some research that we've done on educator preparation and licensure with Dan Goldhaber and others at Calder, the Center for the Analysis of Longitudinal Data in Education Research. So I want to talk about both what we're learning from the partnership, but also how the partnership evolved over time and how that type of work has kind of taken off in Massachusetts. So I'm going to show you in terms of findings, some findings from our first project and then also from our most recent project. And the most recent one is definitely still in working paper form, so I'd be very happy to hear feedback, questions, suggestions on that one. I'm also happy to hear on the other one, but it is published, so it's less helpful on those. So what I want to begin with is talking about what makes for a strong research partnership. And I think, to me, it's a confluence of three things. It's good questions, good researchers, and resources. So I'm going to talk a little bit about each of these, starting with the questions, which in my case evolves from our research agenda. So our research agenda is driven by our agency's strategic priorities. These are they. These have been our priorities for at least 5 or 6 years at this point. So we've tried to develop a string of research related to each of them so that we can help advance and learn from our work and improve it over time. For a long time, our research agenda was really just in my head. You know, it was sort of like I knew what projects we were working on, I knew who we were working with. And then a few years ago, I had the thought, perhaps I should actually write this down. Like, it might be useful if I had it documented. I could give it to other people. Like, it might help me see some things. And the act of my doing that is what generated this partnership. Because what it made me realize is that in the promoting educator development area, we had a bunch of work related to educator evaluation, which was a big initiative at that point, getting to the point that we were pretty well up and running on changing the way teachers are evaluated in Massachusetts. So that project was starting to come to a close, and I was asking the program folks, what do you think the next big thing is that you're going to tackle? And they said teacher preparation and licensure. And they had a ton of questions that they wanted answered about, you know, what's the relationship between different pathways into the profession and what happens to teachers when they end up in practice and that kind of thing. And I thought, we don't have anybody working with us on questions about this. We have nothing. We need to come up with a partner. So in this case, excuse me, what we were trying to get at was some stuff around, like, oh, I lost my train of thought. Hold on. So they were trying to answer this question of how workforce outcomes vary for teachers from different pathways. And what happened was we happened to have a relationship with Dan and the Calder team already from a different project. So the project we worked with them on before had to do with trying to figure out whether your measures of value added were different or changed if either the standards underlying the assessment changed or the assessment itself changed. Did you get a different answer on value added? Which it was sort of funny. I saw him presenting it at APAM. With preliminary findings from 3 or 4 other states, and I walk up to him just on a whim afterwards. I was like, any chance you'd throw Massachusetts in this analysis? Because we had basically nothing but standards and assessment changes for about 3 or 4 years at that point, and I thought, man, if this matters in our context, I'd really like to know that because we use these measures a lot. So we had already done that project, but we had never done anything with Dan on or anyone on ed prep, and meanwhile, that's really his big area of expertise. He does a ton of stuff in Washington on educator preparation and licensure. So I knew he knew the research context in Massachusetts, and he knew the sort of the way studies in this area are typically designed from his Washington work. And so that's sort of where the researchers came from for the project. In terms of the resources, this was probably the least replicable way of getting resources I've ever had, which was I got a random phone call from a budget analyst in the state legislature who basically called up and was like, do you want $300,000 for research? And I was like, yes. What's the catch? It turns out that he was feeling frustrated that the state would invest all this money in different programs and nobody ever would do an evaluation to see not only whether it had an impact, but also what the cost benefit was. And so he was trying to spur some cost benefit type analysis. So I said, sure, I'll take your $300,000, and we had to do 2 projects with it, and this was one of the ones we chose. It was a little hard to back into doing cost benefit, but we did figure out a way to do it, and we got done this other thing that we really cared about that has turned out to be the beginning of this really great partnership over the last 4 years or so. So that's kind of how the project got up and running. What the first project we did is what we call the teacher pathways study. So we're talking about the pathways teachers take into the profession. And what we were trying to get at was, once teachers get into practice, what is their value added for those where we have that data? It's not everybody. What are their evaluation ratings? So this is their performance rating from usually their principal or their curriculum director or whatever. How do they get rated on their practice? And then attrition, do they stay in the field? And we were interested in how those outcomes vary depending on what kind of license you have and what kind of preparation program you have. So I need to give you a little bit of context on what these things mean in Massachusetts, just so you kind of can frame it. An initial license is what people think of as a typical teacher's license. This is somebody who went to an undergraduate education program, and they were trained as an undergraduate to become a teacher. They then get an initial license in whatever their subject matter, or sometimes multiple subject matters, is. So this is kind of like the standard way people come into the profession. We also have a preliminary license in Massachusetts. This is for people who decide either later on at some point that they would like to become a teacher. And what you do, you have to pass the MTEL, which is the state teacher test, and you have to have an undergraduate degree. And that's sufficient to get 5 years of a provisional license where you can teach as a teacher of record in a classroom. And then you have to, during that time, work towards an initial license. So eventually you go and get that initial license. A third, this is much less used, but we also have a temporary license for educators moving in out of state. So I think they have to have at least 3 years of teaching experience in whatever state they were in, and then they have like a 1 year to kind of get switched over to the regular standard license. So one important methodological note just to keep in your head is that those preliminary or provisional licenses eventually become initial licenses, but we didn't count them there, right? So if they started as a provisional, we count them as provisional, even if they later get an initial license. So that's the licensure pathways. In terms of program types, we have 3. Undergraduate, again, is that typical undergrad ed major who goes on and becomes a teacher right out of college. We also have postgrad, so these are people who have BAs and then decide to go become a teacher, often like a 1-year program, but still a relatively traditional academic program. And then we have alternative programs, which are things like the Boston Teacher Residency or Match Charter School has a teacher prep program. These are often more practice-based, where you're mainly in a classroom, and then there's some sort of content that goes along with it, but the structure's a little different. So that's sort of the types of pathways we were looking at, the outcomes. I want to just say from the beginning, this is descriptive work. We did not randomly assign teachers to the pathways. That would have been fantastic, but I have a feeling we would not have been very popular. So what we really just wanted to understand is just what is, but this is way more sophisticated than we had ever been able to do before. We had not attempted to do value-added modeling like this. We had not mapped out all these pathways. We had just kind of like looked at kind of high-level statistics. So this is taking us to a new level and answering some new questions that we couldn't answer before. So here's a high level of what we learned, and then I'm going to dig a little deeper. Excuse me. In terms of evaluation ratings, the more non-traditional entry points into the profession, often we're actually getting higher practice ratings. So the postgrad and the alternative programs were often doing a little better. Preliminary licensees, these are the ones who had no ed prep background at all, were often a little lower. Value added, it was probably lower for the preliminary, but it's kind of marginal. And then there weren't many other issues. And then we had some, I'm happy to get into the details if you want, but essentially kind of depended on how you modeled it, what answer you got. So we didn't feel like we had a solid thing that no matter what way you looked at it, we got the same answer. And then in attrition, we found that alternative programs and preliminary licensees were more likely to leave. So we're seeing some interesting patterns where, at least at times, the non-traditional entry points sometimes are generating better results, not always, and often just no difference, right? And meanwhile, they haven't had to invest in the teacher program. At the same time, those pathways, the teachers are sometimes less likely to stay in the profession. So let me dig a little deeper on how we looked at this. I'm going to show a bunch of charts that look like this. So I'm going to orient you carefully to this one, and hopefully it will transfer to future. So on the y-axis here, we have, in this case, their summative rating. So this is their performance rating once they become real teachers of record in the classroom. at the state level, we get their overall summative rating, and then there's 4 standards below that. Here we're just looking at the summative rating, not the standard level, and we've just coded it 1 to 4. The lowest level is 1, the highest level is 4. So 3 is considered proficient. In this case, I'm looking at which pathway. Did they go through a regular undergrad program, a postgrad, or alternative? And we did these relative to undergrad. So relative to a typical program, people coming through the postgrad pathways had somewhat higher ratings, and people coming from alternative had much higher ratings. These are 95% confidence intervals, so these are both statistically significantly different from 0. So relative to the undergrad, the postgrad and alternative are getting somewhat better ratings. Here's the value-added models. We have math on the left, ELA on the right, on the y-axis, and then we're looking at here the pathways again, undergrad, postgrad, alternative, and we did one model where we didn't include student fixed effects and another one where we did, and you kind of get more or less the same answer no matter how you look at it. In ELA, there's a little bit of a sense that postgrad might do slightly better, but we kind of looked and we're like, given that it goes away when you do the model the other way, we weren't so sure that that was meaningful. And here, we're looking, instead of looking at what type of program you went through, we're looking at what license you have. And these are relative to the initial license, which again is sort of the typical way of getting into the profession. And on the value added, again, I would say not a huge difference. There's a slight indication that math might be lower, but it wasn't super definitive. And then on the summative rating, you see that relative to initial, the preliminary do worse and the temporary do better. So I think that's okay. And then when you get to attrition, here we're looking at the likelihood of staying in the profession, and this is annual estimates, right? So I would interpret that 0.06 as being that 6% of people from undergrad programs leave the profession each year. And by leave the profession, I mean they don't show up in our state data again. They could have gone to another state or something, but they're not in Massachusetts. And then meanwhile, the postgrads, about 7% leave, and alternative programs, about 8.5% leave. So you've got about roughly a third more likely to leave the profession if you're in an alternative program relative to an undergrad. And you see something kind of similar for licensure pathway. The temporary folks are more likely to leave, preliminary more likely to leave. So what did we take away from this? Oh, I forgot. This was actually one of the most interesting things we did. So we also broke it down to the program level. So rather than looking just statewide, we also said for each preparation program in the state, what's their typical impact? And so you can see here, the green ones are the ones that are not statistically significantly different from 0. We have a handful that are below, they're red, a handful above that are blue. I mean, what we basically take away from this is that they're all kind of the same, right? They're more or less all the same. But we do have some interesting outliers that we actually know which ones these are. I didn't put it up on there, but we now then can go to these programs and find out, well, what is it that this program is doing, or this one, that we might learn from, and what is going on with these red ones that we might want to maybe change our preparation program approval requirements if we see that they don't have some element of in their program that the higher performing ones do. So this was probably the most useful thing that we did. It was also an interesting example of how data visualization really matters. So our main takeaway that we wanted people to take away from this is that most of the programs look the same. There's a handful that look different, but mostly the same. Our first visualization of this instead sorted low to high on the average impact estimate. And what immediately that takes you to is like, well, what's up with the high ones and what's up with the low ones? And it's just not, sorry, AV person, I messed up your thing. That's not what we want people to be focused on. So it was actually a really instructive moment for me of like, oh, we need to be thoughtful about how we present this to people. We also, by the way, for the programs involved, we gave them reports where they knew, like, I am program 60. We didn't tell them what any of the others were, but they could tell where they were on these charts, which was useful feedback for them because that gave them a sense of, like, especially the ones that are high or low, they would have had no way to know how they would compare to other programs if we hadn't produced reports like that. So what we learned from this are a couple things. One is that ed prep can really matter. It does predict future teacher outcomes, which wasn't necessarily a given, right? That the prep program does seem to have some relationship. It actually, in the case of value added, explains a decent amount of the value added, even though that's not a huge impact. And that variation that we saw gives a lot of opportunity to learn and improve. So that was kind of exciting for those of us who are trying to get started on a new research agenda, to have a few things we could take away from it. And then we started to think, well, what else can we do? We've had a lot of projects since then. We've had some really fun stuff. So remember how I mentioned that we needed to do a cost-benefit analysis as part of the requirement of the funding source? We have this weirdo performance-based option for getting your initial license. Remember how I said if you come in with just an undergrad degree, you get that provisional license and then you work towards initial? Most people meet that requirement by getting an undergrad degree, a master's degree in some sort of teaching thing. That's the way they accomplish that. But we have a performance-based option. And we thought, well, this is kind of an interesting cost-benefit opportunity because it's a lot cheaper to do this performance-based program. So it'd be useful to know, do the candidates that come out of that program look any different from the ones who've paid a lot more money for whatever program they did? And sort of what's the cost to the student and to the state of these types of programs? So that's how we kind of checked that box. It turns out, unsurprisingly, that the candidates who do the performance-based program don't really look any different than the ones who go through prep programs, which you would expect given what we had seen previously. And it's a lot cheaper. And it turns out, which we didn't know, that program is generating, I think 10% of the arts teachers in the state. It's a lot of the non-ELA math programs are what use these a lot. And it's actually essentially our single largest alternative program, which we didn't know. We did kind of a cool policy brief on teacher equity gaps where we looked at the likelihood that, for example, a poor student is assigned to a novice teacher relative to a non-poor student, and we have reports that we give to districts on this that show them for all different subgroups and different educator effectiveness measures, and we wanted to be able to show them why they should care, right? So, okay, great to know that poor kids are 30% more likely to have a novice teacher, but why does that matter? And so they helped us develop some reviews of the literature to show that has, it translates to something like 2 to 4 weeks of student learning every year for that kind of a teacher assignment. So that was fun. Skipping ahead, external validity of the state licensure test. We'll see how this goes. We're trying to figure out whether we could essentially design our state licensure test in a way that was more predictive of the teacher's effectiveness in practice. Right now, as we develop these tests, there's no way for them to check that because they administer the test, and then years later, the person shows up in practice. But we now have enough data that we could look to see which types of items correlate with stronger or weaker performance, and then hopefully improve our test. And then the thing I wanted to talk about today is the candidate assessment of performance. So let me describe for you a little bit what the CAP is. So remember I mentioned that educator evaluation was a big initiative for the state for educators in practice, and we had kind of gotten to the point that was up and running in the state. Well, the main mechanism we envision, the reason why we think that should matter is that it should be giving better feedback to the educators about their practice. And our educator prep folks had set a goal for themselves that they wanted to get to the point that our novice teachers in their first year of teaching are as effective as what our currently third year teachers are. So they're trying to get that learning curve out of the classroom and into their prep program so that teachers come in more effective. And they thought perhaps one mechanism to do this would be to get them more feedback on their practice earlier before they end up actually being the teacher of record. So that was what generated the idea of the candidate assessment of performance. It's now a requirement for anyone doing an initial license, which again is that traditional undergrad license, that they must participate in the CAP as part of their preparation program. So I'll come back and explain a little bit more detail of what that looks like, but that's kind of the broad framing of what we're trying to accomplish. And so we put in a IAS RPP grant to try to do essentially a predictive validity study. Does the CAP actually predict whether the teacher is effective once they get to practice? And we have 3 questions that we are going to be looking at over the course of this grant. The first one is the one I'm going to focus on today, which is whether the CAP scores predict that in-service summative rating. So once they get into practice and their principal observes their classroom, the rating they get from that. We are also going to look at whether CAP predicts value added and whether the relationships vary for different types of teachers, different kinds of experience, that sort of thing. We don't have enough data really to do the second questions yet, but we can look at this first question. So that's where we are. So here is an example of the type of element that a teacher is going to be evaluated against. It is not important that you actually be able to read those words. I would never put something up that you actually need to read. What I want to show you is that for this item, adjustment to practice, there are 4 possible ratings: unsatisfactory, needs improvement, proficient, or exemplary. And that item, 1B2, is one of 6 items from our teacher evaluation rubric in practice. In practice, we have something like 4 standards, and I want to say it's like 20 or 30 indicators. And we convened a group of stakeholders to help us figure out which of those indicators are the most important for novice teachers. What do they really have to come in on day 1 able to demonstrate proficiency on? So they came up with these 6 that I've listed on the right. The one I highlighted here is adjustment to practice, which has to do with that they can differentiate 4 different types of students. There's also having well-structured lessons, meeting diverse needs, safe environment, high expectations, and reflective practice. So we have these 6 things are what they're going to get evaluated on. There's 4 possible scores, as I described, unsat through exemplary. There are 3 dimensions on each of these. So the first is quality, which is just, can you do this with good quality? The second is scope. Can you do this for all students? And consistency, can you do this all the time? So you're getting an unsat to exemplary rating on 3 dimensions on 6 rubric elements. And you're getting these ratings twice. There's a formative that's like roughly halfway through your student teaching experience, and then a summative at the end. So what you end up with statistically is 18 scores in all, right? 6 rubric elements, 3 dimensions. And then the scores can range from a 1 on everything to a 4 on everything. So you can get anywhere from an 18 to a 72. I feel like I should pause here for a second because that was a lot of detail. So does anyone have a question, sort of just what the deal is with this evaluation rating? Yes?
Just wondering about the source of evidence. How does someone make a decision about where a candidate is on this rubric?
That's a great question. So the person who provides the rating is the supervising practitioner. This is essentially the teacher that they're student teaching with. And we have on top of this quantitative study, we also have a qualitative study being done by a different research team to understand better the implementation. And one of the things that is surfaced is that although our preparation programs are pretty clear about this, they haven't done a great job yet of making sure the supervising practitioner, like that we're calibrated well on how they're rating these things. So, I see what you're saying. I believe I'm 90% certain, if not 99% certain, that it's observation-based. So it's essentially the professional judgment of that educator. They don't have to produce like evidence of lesson plans or something like that. That's actually also true in our regular system, that like it depends on the district and how they've chosen to implement what constitutes evidence for these things. Sure. Anybody else have a question about? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep, that's a great question that I wish I knew the answer to. I was joking when I was preparing for this. Roddy Theobald, who's sort of the day-to-day lead on this, he was like, oh, I could totally be like your phone-a-friend. But like if you're not sure, but I was like, I didn't have a program phone-a-friend. If you'd asked me a statistical question, I'm prepared to call Roddy at an instant's notice. But I'm not actually sure on I think how we differentiate those two things. They do seem quite overlapping, and I'm sure that there is knowing this team, a very thoughtful differentiation between them, but I can't articulate it to you. So, in back.
Yes. In formulating this, did you look at the National Board for Professional Teacher Certification? They can do it after, you can apply to be board certified after 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
That seems to have elements you don't have in it.
Well, and that's for teachers in practice, right? Whereas this is meant to be an early rating for,
You can deduct back from that, it seems to me, not only in what you're looking for, but how you measure.
yeah, again, knowing this team, I am sure they looked at all the available models. It's always, anytime you're in a policymaking situation, there's always a balancing of research evidence where it exists, existing models, stakeholder feedback, and so my guess is they were trying to fit in between a bunch of different things. We also don't have a ton of national board certified teachers in Massachusetts. It hasn't been a big push the way I know some other states have done it, so it's not as much as part of the policy narrative as it might be elsewhere. Although we're certainly familiar with the standards and that kind of thing, and I think they were part of what we used to develop the EdEval, like the one for teachers in practice, that was part of how we thought about it. Any other questions about what the deal is technically with this? Okay, so first I'm showing you what the distribution of the final summative cap rating is. So this is the second student teacher rating, the one they get right at the end of their teaching. And you see this generally pretty nicely distributed, except for, oh, how funny that a third of the scores are 54. Any guesses as to why 54 might be the score? There's a ton of students. Yep, you get proficient on all four things. It turns out that will add up to a 54. So 90% of the people in this 54 category got a 3 on everything. The other 10% have maybe an exemplary on one and needs improvement on another, and it added up to 54. So I'm glad to see the differentiation here. We were worried it might not be that differentiated, but it's still a little worrisome that we're 35% of teachers in their first rating, by the way, not even the one that counts, just the first rating are being told they're proficient. I'm sorry, that was the final rating. This is the formative rating. So I put that arrow in the exact same spot so you could kind of remember where 33 was. So we still have a lot of loading on that 54, but it's less, right? So it looks like educators are trying to use that formative rating as a place to send a signal of where the candidate needs to improve, and then they're moving them to proficient as they gain those skills. So this is consistent with, I know, for example, Jason Grissom has some stuff looking at the way principals use evaluation ratings when they count versus when they don't count. This is the same kind of pattern that he finds in his work. So, which again, it's good that they are trying to use it. Oh, the other thing I should say, if you watch the distribution here. So the final rating's higher. And then it's lower in the early, and then it moves up. So presumably that's in part that the candidates truly are getting better at building those skills. That's part of what their program is supposed to be. It may also be that the final summative rating is they have to get certain scores on that in order for their program to endorse them for a license, right? So essentially to actually become a teacher, you have to get proficient on a bunch of these things. So in this case, where it's actually consequential for whether the kid can graduate with their degree or not, they're scoring higher. And then in the formative, they're scoring lower, where they're trying to say, starting to worry a little. So that's kind of what the distribution looks like. And here I want to show you how those ratings from the student teaching experience relate to what happens when they show up in practice. So we've had enough time now that we can actually see what these candidates' ratings are in their first year of teaching. And what we see is, so I should say that both the dependent and independent variable are standardized. They're on a mean 0, standard deviation 1, so these are effect size units. So if you look at the summative student teacher rating and how it relates to their first year in practice rating, a 1 standard deviation increase in the summative rating is associated with about a 0.15 increase in the rating once they're in practice. So we were super excited that this wasn't 0. This is always the worry in a validity study. It's actually statistically significant. All the numbers that are red are statistically significant as we go along, so there's a statistically significant difference there. And it's decent sized, which is great. We also looked at how those formative ratings, so the earlier rating relates, and it's a slightly higher rating. I don't think that's a statistically significant difference. I think that's basically the same. Then we looked at summative controlling for the formative and formative controlling for the summative, right? So put them both in the equation at the same time. Now, this is super interesting to me because it shows that the information that is coming out of the rating is mainly coming from that formative rating. Once you've controlled for the formative rating, the summative rating is no longer statistically significant. So that, to me, also is consistent with this idea that the formative rating is the thing that's really sending the signal about the teacher's performance, and that's what's showing up later on when they end up in practice. Then we started to think about, like, all right, we can't do causal inference here, but what other things might we want to control for that might help us be a little more convinced by our findings? Here we looked at that summative rating plus holding institution level fixed effects. So this is like Bridgewater State. So we're comparing within Bridgewater State and how their candidates did once they got to practice. Within Salem State, within Harvard, how do their candidates do? And you again get a pretty similar relationship, a positive statistically significant relationship between those student-teacher ratings and what happens later on. This is another really interesting one. So we said, well, what if you control for their MTEL scores? The MTEL is the state teacher test that they have to take as part of their license. And even after controlling for the MTEL, you still get a statistically significant positive impact, which suggests that this cap is capturing something different about their qualification for being a teacher than the license test is. And we've also, I should mention that we've done a separate piece of work that shows that the MTEL is correlated with effectiveness later on. So it's not that it's just not correlated with anything, but we think this means it's potentially capturing a different dimension, which I think is useful. Yes?
Do you find a relationship between CAP scores and whether you see people later on showing up at all?
Yeah, that's a great question that we have not investigated yet. Most people who finish these programs do end up becoming teachers, but you do wonder whether, like, if you have to have passed the CAP in order to show up as a teacher, but
Sort of that lower part of the distribution where they're getting scores on.
exactly. Almost everyone passes the CAP, though, in the end. Like, almost everyone gets the score that they need to get. But there's enough that it'd be worth checking. In fact, I should write that down.
You're sort of like missing some of the variation. There's probably an even stronger relationship than the one you're able to capture just because you're losing the lower end of the distribution.
Right,
And discouraging them from going to
right.
I would imagine, or they're going somewhere else, I would guess.
Right, yeah, they could have gone to a charter. You wouldn't need to have a license. Although, actually, they would show up in our data if they went to a charter. They would still be there. But if they'd gone out of state or to a private school or something like that, we wouldn't see them. Yeah. And you could also you could even use those formative data where we're getting a little stronger signal to say, even if they ultimately passed it, if they got a lower formative rating, did that kind of, like, all right, yeah, they got their degree, but did they actually get dissuaded from becoming a teacher because they got a lot of negative feedback? Mm-hmm.
So just to clarify, this data are only teachers that are in public schools? So is there a phenomenon where the private schools take off the top teachers?
Well, we would have no way to know, really, because we don't know where the other teachers went. But most of our preparation, the bigger thing that happens in Massachusetts is that our prep programs, we're a net exporter of teachers because we have a lot of universities. So something like on average like, let's say we produced 100 candidates statewide, 60 of them will actually end up in teaching in Massachusetts in a public school because a bunch of them are going elsewhere. We know that from the preparation programs do surveys so they know where their alumni ended up, but we don't have a way to track it. Whether we're disproportionately losing the stronger teachers to private schools, I don't think we have any way to really know. We could know whether they showed up in our data, sort of the opposite of yours, but beyond that, we wouldn't know where they had gone. So. Other questions about that? Tom?
The key thing that occurs right at the proficiency level
Mm-hmm.
troubles me a little bit, and I guess I'm wondering and looking at this, if we thought about maybe estimating, having SP mark scores in different bins for different values of the cap.
Mm-hmm.
To see, does it appear to be linear in the way this kind of tacitly assumes? And is there something distinctive about the future performance of the people who've been rated in that?
Mm-hmm.
Like, just give you a little more granularity about the predictive validity.
Yeah. Yep, so we have not done that. This is totally hot off the presses, so this is great suggestions. We just presented this for the first time at AAFP, so it's like in the last 2 weeks we've had these data. or 4 weeks, however long it's been. But we certainly could do that. What we did do here is just the simplest possible thing, add them up. But we absolutely could look at just those candidates or ones that, even just the ones who got all proficients versus others. We did do an analysis that I don't think I included here, where we tried to look and see, does the strength of the predictive validity depend on where you are on the performance spectrum? This chart hurt my head, to be perfectly honest with you. It was kind of like a three-dimensional thing, and I was like, I don't know if I want to try to explain that. But the short version of what we learned from it is that the predictive validity looks strongest in that middle part of the zone, and then sort of tapers off. But the thing that's kind of funny is, like, there's a bunch of teachers who get rated all exemplaries, even in that formative. And that's actually less predictive than candidates who get something less than a perfect. It's more strongly predictive of what finally happens. So what we interpret from that is that there's some raters who are probably just mailing it in and just like, exemplary, sure, looks fine, But what we haven't done is a more refined analysis of sort of, as you just suggested, binning it into categories and seeing how that changes. So I should have brought that slide. I don't think I did. Oh, okay, so the next thing we control for, then we were worried that students' prior academic achievement might be driving some of the performance rating. We had seen that in some of the previous work, that teachers who happened to have students who were higher performing were getting better ratings, so we wanted to try to control for that. And so we took the average prior performance of the class of where they were doing the student teaching, and we still got more or less the same answer. And then we pulled out just the novice teachers, because remember how I said that those preliminary teachers could be teaching and then they have to go back and get their initial degree, so they are already teachers and then they are doing the CAP. Unlike the kids coming from a straight undergrad program who've never been in a classroom, we have some actually experienced educators who might have 2 or 3 years of teaching under their belt and then going through the CAP. And we were worried that if you didn't account for that, you might be seeing a stronger relationship than really is there. But yet, once we looked only at the novice educators, we got more or less the same answer. So we take away a couple things from this. I mean, one thing is we put a lot of effort into intentionally aligning the experience in the CAP with what's going to happen in EdEval. So boy, would it have been disappointing if we hadn't seen some sort of relationship between those things, because that was sort of the point, was to try to make people have an experience similar to what was going to happen. So we were happy to see that did turn out to be in practice, and just that, all of these are positive and only one isn't statistically significant. We could have gotten negative relationships or lots of zeros, and so the fact that we were seeing a pretty consistent story no matter how we looked at it was reassuring. I think it really reinforces the value of the formative assessment and the formative feedback to teachers, that seems to be sending a better signal about their later performance, and we could capitalize on that. But we probably could find some areas for improvement also, especially on the issue of the level of rigor of the scoring. So the fact that we have so many candidates loading onto one rating, or we have these all exemplaries where it's not as predictive as it would have been if they had given a more differentiated rating, gives us some direction from a policy perspective about what we could do to support implementation better. Things like working more closely, not just with the preparation programs, but with the supervising practitioners. The team has actually developed some kind of cool videos where they can do, it's videos of actual classroom practice that are available to both preparation programs and to districts. And they can actually, they've done programs where they have them sit all in the room together, watch the same video and rate on these criteria, and then discuss, why did you rate it this way? Why did you rate it that way? And especially in situations where our districts and our prep folks were often coming with very different expectations, and it's been helped us come to greater agreement about what effective practice looks like, which has been a really useful tool for this kind of issue. So that's sort of what we've taken away from the research project. In terms of what I've learned about partnership from doing this work with them, going back to my framing 3 ideas, one thing that's so important here is that we're really answering critical questions for the agency. These are like top of mind, really important for these program staff. This isn't like a nice to have that like, oh sure, if somebody wants to do that, great. And this team really takes to heart what they learn from the research projects and acts on it in a totally fantastic way. In part because that's their natural orientation, but in part because we are answering questions that help us orient more towards continuous improvement. So these aren't like autopsy things that we did after a program ended, did it work or not. These are along the way, as we're implementing CAP. If we had ended up with a bunch of mush in here, that would have sent a really strong signal to that team. We need to rethink how we're training people to use this program, or maybe we shouldn't do it this way. Maybe we should do something different. So the fact that the questions are so relevant to their work has been incredibly helpful. In terms of the resources, we've been fortunate with this set of projects that we've been able to harness a bunch of resources that get beyond a very traditional academic study. We had that money from the state legislature that I could design fairly flexibly what I wanted to do as long as I figured out some way to do a cost-benefit analysis. We've had an IES RPP grant, which you don't have to have a causal inference design for those types of early partnerships. In one case, I just had a little money left over in a budget that I issued a contract to them so I could design it how I wanted. So it didn't have to be only the more traditional academic things. We had a little more room. And we could do them on policy-oriented timelines. So we could plan for, we know that every summer this team replans how they're doing their work for the next year. So let's make sure, like right now we're working towards May, a May stakeholder meeting where we're going to see some of those other research questions that we haven't gotten to yet. We'll have data on by May, and then that'll immediately go into their planning cycle for the following year. And then in terms of the researchers, this is really, it started with this kind of like random thing where I walked up to Dan at APAM and was like, could you please add my state to your study, to something that's now 4 years in, a really deep, long-lasting, sustained relationship that we really value highly. And I think the story I could tell you that probably best exemplifies this was this great moment that happened a few weeks ago where the team came to me with a new, and this is the other great thing about them, is they come to me with research ideas. I don't have to invent all of the research ideas myself. They came to me because they, a few years ago, totally redesigned what we look for when we approve preparation programs. We're essentially the, what is it called with universities where you accredit it? We're the accreditor for prep programs. They have to be approved by us to exist. And they totally changed what they looked for there to a much more outcome-oriented rather than input-oriented thing. And they wanted to see, was it actually improving teachers' practice? Were they seeing stronger performance ratings, stronger value added from programs that had gone through the approval review? So we're kind of talking through the research questions, what data is available, blah, blah, blah. And at the end, I said to them, well, how do you want to do this project? Do you want to do this internally, or do you want to put a project out for bid? And they said, oh, no, we want to do it internally, so either us or Dan. And I just loved that they thought of Dan as internal, by which they don't mean Dan is co-opted by the agency and is just finding what we want him to find. What they mean is that he's up to speed enough on the policy situation and our data that having him do it is just as easy as having us do it. And that, I think, is, we certainly couldn't have said that 4 years ago, but it was really a powerful moment for me. I was like, okay, these folks have a strong relationship that is not just about me. It's not just about an individual project. This is an ongoing thing that I know that they will continue to want to work with him because they've invested enough time to make this relationship worthwhile. So I think that is my last slide. I am totally happy. I'm sure we have plenty of time for questions. I'm totally happy to answer questions either about this project, other projects I'm working on, state of politics in Massachusetts, Olympic weightlifting if we really get fun. So other questions? Mm-hmm. Uh-huh. Oh, yeah. Yes, we spent a lot of time thinking about this. I'm happy to, boy, I have way too many animations. Okay, there it is. Yep, this one. So you're wondering what's the deal with this one? Yeah. So part of this is a modeling issue. It has to, I'm trying to remember which way we did this particular one. So we had two choices, do we compare within the same school teachers who came from different preparation programs, or do we just look across the state at different preparation programs? And what happens if we look within the school is we sometimes get these crazy confidence intervals, because I don't know if that particular one is Match Charter School, but I'll use an example from Match Charter. Match Charter School has a preparation program where virtually everyone that goes through that prep program becomes hired by Match Charter. So if you're trying to figure out what's the impact of that prep program, you're identifying it on the handful of weird people who went to some other school. So you end up sometimes with these goofy things, and depending on how you model it, you get different answers as to which ones are statistically significant or not. So I think some of it is this just statistical choice we made in terms of which ones ended up where and why they were like that. And I feel like I'm missing a piece of your question that I didn't answer. Was there a second part of it? Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, and that's sort of the piece that we've now been following up on that, is to try to figure out, we unfortunately don't have great, like, easily coded data on the prep like, for example, one thing I would wonder is, what's the student teaching experience like? Is it an embedded thing where you're in the classroom for an entire year? Is it a 300-hour thing? Because, we have minimum requirements, but some programs go far beyond that. And that's the piece we're now trying to figure out. What is it in the programs that seems to be correlated with the higher performing things, so that we can then feed it into that program approval process that I described. If we see a strong enough relationship that we're convinced that it matters, we could then say you have to do it that way. So we're not quite there yet to the what you would have to do, but we're working there. Yeah. You look like you have a question. Yes.
Yeah, when you, maybe you said you're going to look at this, but have you looked at how different elements of the
Oh, like the different pieces of the rubric or whatever? Yeah, well, we are absolutely going to do that, because this team is so great about like redesigning stuff if things aren't working. So one of the things on Dan's list for the next, I don't know, couple months is, like, for example, we would like to know, we made prep programs do these 3 dimensions of practice. To be perfectly honest, that was in part to assuage the prep programs. I don't think we would have necessarily done that ourselves. So we'd like to know if truly only quality is the thing that actually matters, we could make this a lot simpler for people to rate, and we could get rid of the other 2. Or we might find that really, as long as they're nailing well-structured lessons, or maybe it's 2 of them or something, that's what really matters. Or, who knows what it could be. So that's another thing that's on the list, is to try to figure out, is there a way we could tweak this to get the most out of it with the least effort? This was just sort of our best bet at the time of what we thought would matter, or that the prep community or the school districts that were hiring these folks thought would matter. Other questions? Michelle?
Do you look at the kind of qualifications of the cooperating teachers at all? Like their value add or their years of experience?
No, but Dan has some super interesting stuff in Washington about that. Are you familiar with it, or should I give?
In Chicago too.
Yeah.
Show that to be predictive.
Oh, is it Matt Ronfeldt's stuff? Yeah. So Dan did this great project that I would love to do in Massachusetts. I'm hoping we're building towards something like this, where I think it's in the Spokane public schools. He essentially identified particularly effective teachers as measured by value added, and then just typical teachers, and actually got the district to randomly assign which student teachers got which type of supervising practitioner. And it turns out that there's a pretty decent correlation between getting assigned a stronger practitioner and being stronger yourself once you get to practice. But that in the Chicago study, I think, are the only evidence we have along those lines. We don't have something equivalent here. I would love to do something like that. It would require, I think, we would probably have to do that with one of our larger programs. We only have a handful that generate enough candidates that have value-added score. We have all these like little eensy boutique programs that like have 60 students, and there's just not enough data. It would have to be like a Bridgewater State or a Salem State that produces 200 or 300 candidates every year, and that mainly sends them to the same district. We have such a fractured geography. We have 400 districts in the state, so you would have to find the right confluence of places, but I would love to do that. Yes?
I was also curious in terms of how the teachers are using this instrument, like the supervising teachers are using this instrument.
Mhm.
Have you looked at the profiles that come out of these? Like, what I would imagine if this was a really valid instrument is you'd have like some
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes when teachers don't like, or aren't really focusing on a test, they'll just give everyone a 3 or everyone a 2,
Mm-hmm.
give these straight line profiles. Do you see variation in like the kinds of profiles?
Oh, like which types of teachers are more likely to differentiate their rating? Is that what you're asking me?
Are the supervising teachers differentiating among these documents?
All right. I think maybe I'm making more complicated a simple question in my head. Are you just asking, are more teachers differentiating or not? Are you asking about, is a certain type of supervising teacher more likely to differentiate?
No, I'm wondering if are the supervising teachers differentiating at all, or are they generally giving a particular candidate either all ones, all twos, all threes?
Oh, okay. So, I mean, well, we clearly have our, where is it? Our giant loading on proficient. I don't actually know the answer on well, actually, you can see here, this is the all exemplaries, right? So there's more than you would expect given the distribution. It doesn't look like we're seeing, I mean, I guess there's a handful, you probably can't see there. There are a handful of data points past this point. This is not, like the lowest is 18, and we have one observation down here. That must have been a really terrible student teacher to get literally 1 on everything, right? And that's on the final. That wasn't even on the formative. This is probably, well, what's 18 times 2 is 36. So that's more like here. It's a good question. And we could certainly, that would be easy to look at. I have not personally looked to see how many just down one row versus differentiation. And then now I dreamed of a question that you didn't ask me, but I should answer, which is whether certain types of supervising practitioners are more likely to differentiate than others as well. So. Other questions? I saw your hand first. Mm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, Dan did a super, we actually had him keynote a conference of our prep programs at one point, and so he did like a quick analysis on that thing, so I happen to actually know the answer that in our state, and I think this is true generally, candidates are more often having their student teaching experience in a school that is more advantaged than where they ultimately teach as a novice teacher. Not always. I mean, actually, it's about a third of our candidates end up getting hired by the place they student taught, so then it's one and the same, right? But for those that are going elsewhere, they're often ending up in a more challenging, which I think is one of the reasons we have teaching diverse learners, as because it's pretty likely you're going to end up in a place that is more diverse than wherever you're taught. I know in Washington he's done some interesting stuff where he looked at, essentially what happens is these programs will develop relationships with certain districts and they'll just keep feeding their candidates to those districts. But there often are other districts nearby them that have a more diverse population and they haven't built partnerships with. And so in Washington, they're trying to help build those partnerships so that candidates are teaching in an experience more similar to where they're going to end up. Just because I think that's part of what that learning curve in those first couple of years of the field is adjusting to whatever kids you're actually serving. So if you could either have stronger district partnerships with prep programs so that either they're more likely to hire the person from that program and that's more like where they're going to ultimately serve, it would be more powerful. That's as far as we've gotten on that line of inquiry in Massachusetts, so I don't know a lot more detail, but I do know that we're definitely seeing that pattern. So, and it would be preferable if we did not. Although, interestingly, it would make it harder for us to actually evaluate the impact because, when you're evaluating these things, you're essentially conflating the selection into the prep program, whatever happens in the prep program that they actually learn, and you worry that you also have something about their placement mixed into that, like wherever they happen to teach might be driving a little bit of what you view as their effectiveness. And the stronger district partnership we develop, where they're more directly feeding single districts, the more likely we're going to end up in this situation with a very imprecisely estimated value added. So a good thing for the students of the state, hard for the researchers, which I suppose is the right way to balance that. So, did you have a question, Tom?
Yeah, related question. I was curious whether you thought about which pathways, which prep programs are particularly successful
Yeah, that is super high, high on the minds of all of us right now. We have, our state has something like 40% of kids are non-white statewide. Our teaching workforce is something like 6%. It's under 10% not white. And the other thing, we looked a little bit more into this, and it turns out that if you look at the profile of kids in undergraduate programs in Massachusetts, our population is about, the undergraduates in Massachusetts are about 10% black, but our teachers are only about 5%, novice teachers only about 5% black. So we're losing a bunch of candidates that are in higher ed. They're getting a degree, but they're not choosing education as their major. So there's a huge play there that we think could potentially really help if we could get some. The commissioner's actually been doing, like, we had teacher signing day this year where we sort of celebrated people who'd agreed to go on and teach after college and try to do more things. We have a fellows program now for people who are, I think it's for people who are interested in teaching as opposed to current teachers, but to try to, our state struggles a lot with diversity to begin with, and I don't think many of our prep programs, my senses are not, I don't think we're getting a lot of differentiation on who's doing great on meeting diverse learners or something like that. I think they all don't know how to do it and are not necessarily doing a great job reaching beyond the people they normally reach to get candidates. So we would really like to develop more stuff. I'd be curious if people here know about effective programs for increasing the diversity of the workforce. That's something that my commissioner's super, super interested in. So, but it's a hard nut to crack. It's like we have improved over time, but it's like so slow. And then I read this thing the other day, was it in Ed Next? With like the heritability of the teaching profession. Did anybody else see this? That like you're like twice as likely or something to become a teacher if you have a parent relative to other people. It's like, well, crap, if we don't have a lot of diverse teachers to begin with, and we're not benefiting from the heritability of the profession either, So. Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering if of those 40% of teachers who don't show up in your data here in Massachusetts, if there are different demographically, thinking about diversity or diverse candidates going elsewhere.
Yeah, I don't think we're losing candidates that way. That's my preliminary sense. We haven't like dug in the level we should, because mostly these are typically candidates who have come in from out of state and then go back to wherever they came from, and so you figure you're probably selecting on a wealthier population who's more able to go back to where they came from. We could probably check more carefully, but my gut is that isn't the leaky point in the profile. So, did somebody back there have a hand also? Yeah. Well, teachers in charter schools in Massachusetts don't have to have a license, or they can just teach. So the only places that are really funneling into charters are the charters' homegrown programs. They're mostly not hiring licensed teachers. They hire some, but it's probably certainly well less than half of their teachers have licenses. Some of them earn licenses as they become teachers, but they often don't come in with one, and they're not required to have one. Yes.
Are the programs that are producing the higher value-added teachers, are those the same programs that are producing teachers that stay in the profession?
I'm trying to remember. So I think it was a little bit of a mix. Let me see if I can. Okay, so here's the right slide for that. So on the left, it's the three kinds of programs, right? And the alternative and post-grad programs are the ones where the candidates are more likely to leave, and those are also the non-traditional programs. Is that the variation of it you asked me about?
I guess I was wondering if you have like a similar slide as the value-added.
Oh, the higher value-added. There might be one in the paper. We did this like 2 years ago, so I'm not going to remember off the top of my head. I need to use my phone a friend with Roddy. I can text him. So it's probably in the paper. I don't remember off the top of my head what the findings were. The value-added stuff just in general was kind of like a big pile of meh, so my guess is it wasn't terribly differentiating, but it's possible it could have shown an effect on attrition, but not elsewhere. Other questions? Well, if you think of great ideas for what we should be doing in this CAP analysis, please tell me, because we are definitely We have a stakeholder meeting with our prep programs in about a month where we're going to show them these data, and we want to make sure it's as solid as it can be. And actually, Matt Ronfeld is on our advisory group, so we have an expert, but it would be great to have more folks if you're interested in the topic. Thank you all for inviting me today. It was really a great pleasure to be here. Thanks.